All right, we're going to talk about Thomas Jefferson taking office and look at his guiding principles, some of the main things that he did, some of the changes that he brought about. And one of the things that happens that's kind of revolutionary is that a Republican replaces a Federalist, and there's no fighting. There's no revolution. We have one party is out and a new party is in, and no fighting or nothing, any major problems. And that's pretty revolutionary. At that time, it was not real common. And so it was a big event in our history and in the history of government, really, in a lot of ways. And Jefferson's guiding principle is that of a less active government. He does not want to collect more taxes. He would like to collect less. He does not want the government to be involved in more things. He would like the government to do less. So an active government is a government that does more and therefore has more power. A less active government does fewer things and therefore has less power, which is exactly what Jefferson wanted. He did not believe government should be powerful, and so it should do fewer things, which included things like the Bank of the United States. Jefferson disagreed with the Bank of the United States. So as you can see, actually, even from at the bottom of these notes, even though Jefferson disagrees with the Bank of the United States, he ends up keeping it. So as he does, he also pays off state debt. So he doesn't get rid of all Federalist policies when he takes office. But where does he get his ideas? Well, he's primarily influenced by this book written by Adam Smith, known as The Wealth of Nations. And it is published in the same year as our Declaration of Independence in 1776, and it's kind of an economic Declaration of Independence. Prior to this time, kings and monarchs controlled their country's economies very, very carefully. That economic system was known as mercantilism, where the colonies were told what they could buy, and they were supposed to import goods from England. They could only buy certain goods from England. Manufactured goods, they had to sell their goods back to England, and it was a very closely controlled economic activity. And by controlling people's economic activity, you're really controlling them to some extent or another. You're making them less free, and the colonists really were fighting against that and did not appreciate that at all. And so this idea that is talked about in this book, The Wealth of Nations, is called laissez-faire economics, which means let alone. In other words, you just let people alone, let them do what they want to do. It's also referred to as free market economy or sometimes capitalism. And goods and services are exchanged with little regulation in a free market economy. And regulation is really, we regulate things in two major ways. We regulate them through rules, and we regulate through taxes. And so we place rules on what types of, the ways things are done and the economic activity. So if you want to build a house in a certain location, you have to have permission to build from local governments, and depending upon where it is, you may have to get permission from the federal government. If there, for example, the Environmental Protection Agency, if it's in an area that is known as a wetland, there can be regulations that can stop you from building in a place where you would be taking away wetlands, and so there's rules that we put in place, and those rules are usually done for in the name of the public good, usually public safety. Or in the case of like the environment, it's the public good. It's not specifically safety always, although it could be, but it is the idea that we need a healthy environment, obviously, to survive, and so we put regulations to stop certain types of things from happening in ecologically sensitive areas like a wetland or something like that. Another way we regulate is through taxes. So you tax something, the more taxes you put on something, the less people are going to purchase it generally. So therefore, everybody needs to eat, so we don't put taxes on food. But we don't want people to smoke, so we put really high taxes on cigarettes and smoking. And so we use taxes as a way to try to control people to some extent or another. Obviously, to some extent, we're also recognizing that governments need money to provide all the services we expect governments to provide, and so they have to tax. And so we try not to tax food, but we do tax other things that are necessary, but like clothes, there's taxes on clothes. If you buy clothes, you need clothes, but of course we can't decide we're not going to tax anything. Another part of this idea of the free market economy is this idea that the competition, if you have the fewer rules you have, you're not saying who can do what. That's going to create competition, and this competition between businesses and things like that would benefit everyone, not just the wealthy. Because in an economy where people are in charge, where the king is in charge, he can set rules that help and benefit those people that he likes and those people that he agrees with. And so rules are set based on to benefit people. Well, who's going to know the king? Who's going to be friends with the king? The wealthy. So who's going to know the president? Who's going to be able to benefit from those people that are in Congress? Well, it's most likely going to be the wealthy. So if your economy or your government has fewer regulations and rules, then you don't have the opportunity to help out your friends and hurt your enemies. And so competition in this idea would benefit everybody. Well, how is this different from Alexander Hamilton and the Federalist? Well, he doesn't actually change a lot of Federalist policies. One that he does is the repeal of the whiskey tax. But part of why he doesn't change a lot of Federalist policies is because some of the ones that they disagreed with the most, that the Republicans disagreed with the most, were rules that were not passed. For example, a high tariff. You'll remember the Federalists wanted a high tariff. That's a high tax on imported goods. Well, that's not what passed. A more moderate tariff passed. And so he doesn't have to reverse that policy because he's not opposed to that policy as much. Another policy that didn't end up passing that was a Federalist policy was helping out manufacturing and giving subsidies or money to people that were going to create factories. And that doesn't happen. And so he doesn't have to oppose that or repeal that because it's not in place. As we said, he did keep the Bank of the United States, and he does continue to pay off state debts, both of which were Federalist policies. And what goes hand in hand with his economic policy is this idea that we should have less government. And the fastest way to decrease the size of government is simply to reduce spending. If you reduce spending, you have less money, you're doing fewer things, and then you have a less active government. And at that time, one of the easiest ways to reduce the size of government was to reduce the size of the Army and the Navy. We will see, though, in some problems that Hamilton, but that Thomas Jefferson faces. He's may wish he hadn't reduced the size of the Navy as much as he does, because he's going to need that Navy shortly. Another thing that he does is he pardons those that had been imprisoned under the Sedition Acts. That act had expired, but he goes ahead and those that had already been prosecuted and convicted of crimes of violating the Sedition Act, he pardons them and lets them go so that they are no longer imprisoned for simply exercising their First Amendment rights to free speech. Another big part of Jefferson's presidency is what happens in the court system, and we'll do an activity over this decision in a few days. But this first off, what happens, and this is, as you'll notice, it says off to the side, it says before Jeff, and so that means before Jefferson, this is what happens. Congress increases the number of federal judges when John Adams is still president, and so he begins to fill the appointments with Federalist judges. And John Marshall is appointed Chief Justice of the Supreme Court this time. And that's going to have a huge impact. John Marshall is going to remain Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for a very long time and is going to be very influential in kind of directing and guiding our nation from the position of the Supreme Court. He's going to have several very influential Supreme Court decisions. And so long after the Federalist Party is gone, that the Federalist influence will remain because John Marshall is really a Federalist. Republicans are upset about this because they say that John Adams should let the new president appoint the judges. So he makes all these appointments that happen after he's lost re-election, but before the inauguration has happened. So he is in that period that we sometimes refer to as lame duck. In other words, he's no longer he has lost the election, but he's still president. And so Republicans didn't think he should appoint the judges, but of course there's nothing in the Constitution that stops him from doing so, and so he does appoint judges. One of those judges that he appoints is a guy by the name of William Marbury, and he is appointed the night before Adams leaves office. And James Madison, refuses to deliver the papers confirming William Marbury's appointment. So William Marbury actually sues James Madison, who is the Secretary of State for Thomas Jefferson, who's the newly elected president. And Marbury loses because the Supreme Court declares the law unconstitutional. It's a little more complicated than that, but this is the first time that the Supreme Court actually declares a law unconstitutional. And this sets an important precedent of judicial review. And so the Constitution doesn't specifically say that the Supreme Court or any of the federal courts have the right to declare laws unconstitutional, but it is the principles within that Constitution that John Marshall uses to point out and uses to justify declaring that law unconstitutional. This is the first time that happens, so this sets the precedent of judicial review, and we'll look a lot more carefully at this precedent in a few days when we're doing an activity with Marbury versus Madison. So that's it. That's a quick intro to Thomas Jefferson and his presidency.